Hello and welcome to Weird Heat. I'm Brian Altano, this is Max Scoville, and Weird Heat is a show about life, creativity, concepts, and just a whole bunch of stuff like that.
A show about concepts. Imagine that.
It's heady.
It's a little bit high concept, but I feel like people are kind of catching on. Each week we take a different concept and we dig into it and try to pick it apart. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those concepts are so big we don't actually do it every week. We do it really every other week. So
that's right. So this week we're talking about isolation, which I think is a weird thing for two people to talk about because it's sort of antithetical to what that word is, or maybe not. So let's dig into it. I want to talk about sort of the good sides of isolation, the bad sides of it, the negative connotations around it, how it helps us, how it hurts us, and hopefully try to figure it out a little bit. We won't solve it because it's not really a crime.
Yeah, no, I don't think isolation as the concept is really necessarily bad. I think that would be a little bit weird to be like, we're going after this incredibly vague thing and we're going to
hunt it down and kill it. No. So I guess we'll talk about sort of like what our gut reactions are to hearing that word. What's yours, Max?
Oh, so I think of living in the middle of the woods when I was growing up. Yeah. I lived in a very small town, and I lived sort of off the beaten path from like the sort of center of town. I lived in like a house in the woods, and I was just alone a lot, and I felt very, very lonesome. So I think isolation, I think of solitude and of just not being, not being near anybody.
So, and is that kind of like a negative memory?
It's mostly a bad thing, but at the same time, I do oftentimes find myself wanting more of that. I find myself kind of craving solitude or some peace and quiet or time to myself.
Yeah. So to me, it's slightly more positive. To me, it's like I'm in a room with a nice carpet and I have headphones on and I'm listening to something or watching something or making music or something, and I'm sort of the outside world around me is not necessarily there, but it's also not like present in a way where it's getting in the way of what I'm trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So I looked up the definition of isolation, and it's got a bunch of different kind of different iterations and versions and stuff, and there's the scientific meaning and everything. But I thought it was interesting because to isolate means to set apart from others, or it can mean to separate from another substance so as to obtain pure or in a free state. So I kind of like that because it's sort of there's the kind of neutral, like, hey, it's just a thing by itself. And then there's a thing by itself because the rest of the shit is bad.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting way of putting it, because right off the bat, if you ask, I believe most people what isolation is, they would say somebody by themselves, me by myself, and then you would think of someone as sort of withdrawn or a hermit, lonely, right? Antisocial, all those sort of words that come into play. But the idea of isolating one thing to focus on it is also, I think, a tremendously positive thing. I mean, it's something that like chefs do, right? Where they sort of, they go like, here is an egg, here is how I focus on just that, here's how I celebrate this. I mean, you are like, on your birthday, you're isolated in a way that it's people looking at you, putting a spotlight over you, singing to you. You're surrounded by people, hopefully, or maybe not. Maybe that's not what you want. But you are the center of attention. The viewpoint is isolated on you and you only.
Yeah, there's also that. I know a lot of people get that sense of the bad sense of isolation when if they're feeling anxious or socially awkward or depressed or whatever. There's that feeling of being alone in a crowd, which is not a great feeling, Maybe some people are into that, but I think that it's interesting how you can have that sensation of being distant from everything without actually physically being distant from things.
Yeah, I feel like that's something that most people deal with on a daily basis in public transportation. It's this very disconnected, disparate group of people who are all introverted momentarily because they are on their own shit, in their own world, heading in their own directions, or in a shared direction. And they've got headphones in, they've got their phones out, they're playing something, they're reading something, whatever it is. And they're completely isolated despite being in an incredibly crowded place.
Yeah, I think there's that effort to sort of, maybe it's a little bit awkward to be shoved in a steel tube with a bunch of strangers, some of whom smell strange. So, like, maybe there's kind of like isolation is sort of a defense mechanism of sort of being like, maybe just, keep your distance.
And I think that's sort of acceptable, right? I think there's like a level of it where people are sort of like, don't bother me before I've had my coffee. Don't bother me while I'm on my commute. Like, I'm in my zone. I'm in my own head. I'm getting ready for my day. Leave me alone.
Yeah.
And that's okay. I think that's a good time to be isolated. Then there's doing that exact same act when you're out to dinner with 8 people. And all of a sudden, it's not necessarily the best thing to do.
Yeah.
You're forced out of isolation in those scenarios.
Yeah, I think isolation in sort of in the age of social media is an interesting concept. Apologies for my noisy little dog here. But I mean, there's that feeling where you can be surrounded by people, and maybe that's not the people you want to be surrounded with, or maybe you want that layer of kind of that, I don't know, that force field of if you're on your phone at a party. Like you're still sort of interacting with people around you, but at the same time, it's not the people directly around you; it's people elsewhere, and it's a kind of I don't know.
Yeah, it's odd because when someone says "leave me alone," it's like almost the gut reaction is that it's troubling, right? And that this person is withdrawn and doesn't want to be bothered by anybody else because everyone else is annoying or they're in a bad mood or something like that.
It's interesting how many like. My fiance will occasionally, she's like, I just need some alone time. And I'll be like, oh, okay, I'll, give you some space. And she'll be in the bedroom or whatever. And I'll be, in the other room and I'll go on Twitter or something. And I'll see that she's like interacting with people on there. And I'm like, how is that alone? Is that alone time still?
Right.
Does that count,
Right.
And it's interesting because I don't know, people physically distant from everybody else, like, maybe you still, write letters to people. Maybe still people call people on the phone, but like, I don't know how much value is the physical presence side of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very firm believer that isolation is one of the most important things you can do as a sort of like a creative individual, and that it's odd because creativity is effectively like a personal experience that if you choose to share it, then gets turned into something that's the opposite of what it started out as, right? Creativity is like, for example, when I make music, I'm isolated. I have noise canceling headphones on. I am in my zone. I'm staring at a screen. I have a keyboard in front of me. I've blocked out the outside world, and I've created a piece of sound that I then, if everything goes correct, will share with thousands of people or hundreds of people, whatever it is. And I find that really interesting because it's taking this very, very private thing that was made while I was isolated and kind of choosing willingly to rip that out and bring it to a bunch of other people. And I think the good and bad of that is that it doesn't hit any roadblocks along the way. But on the same page, there's no one there between my isolation and the publicity of the art to step in and go, that's not good. And maybe that's hurtful, maybe that's helpful. Like, I think, like, I don't know, like, there's a lot of times where I make something and I think it's the best thing in the world, and then I put it out there and it doesn't necessarily resonate with people.
Yeah, totally.
And there's other times where showing that to people along the way will help me out because they'll see something, like I'll show you art that I'm working on, and you'll see something that I didn't see. You'll give me a suggestion for it, and you made it better along the way. And there's other times where someone goes like, I have an idea, and they do this thing. We tend to call it like Monday morning quarterback, which I think is based on the fact that football is played on Monday nights. And it's a guy or Sundays.
I think it's Sundays. Like the next day, everyone's like, I would have thrown the ball hard and it would have gone way down the field.
Yeah, which is also sort of backseat driving and stuff like that.
I also don't know what the quarterback does. I don't think does he throw the ball?
Yeah, and you don't really drive, so we're kind of fucked on all these metaphors.
Not doing so hot.
Either way, I think that's an important part of the creative process, but I think a lot of it begins with isolation and thinking about shared creative projects. Bands, working on music, working on movies and stuff like that. A lot of that is restaurants, right? It's people who have an individually isolated craft that they are now joining into others who are doing the same. A band is a guy who's really good at guitar that he mostly played by himself, and a guy who's really good at drums and a woman who's really good at singing, whatever it is. They bring all of these isolated frequencies into one place and they create something that's shared that you will then maybe hand to somebody else that only listens to in their headphones in an isolated form.
Yeah.
I find that so interesting.
One expression I've always loved is that you can't write comedy in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Which I don't entirely agree with. I think that there's different kinds of comedy, obviously. But I think there's that idea that, like, in order for comedy to work, you have to you have to have an audience in mind. You have to have a target. Like there has to be that, like the idea of laughter there's something, tied to communication in there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't know, I think some people just work better in isolation or in a vacuum, but I mean, that's getting into semantics a whole lot. But, I think collaboration and creativity are kind of a key.
Yeah.
Like a key thing to look at.
I think it's really important because it's taking like very historically kind of lonely moments. And again, lonely, one of those words that has a sort of negative connotation to it. And it's bringing them together in a shared experience. Like, I realize, like, the more I grow up, thanks, Peppers, music is, like, an incredibly important part of my life. I create it, I share it, I listen to it all the time. It's not necessarily a communal part of my life. Like, actually, most of the music I listen to is in solidarity. Like, I actually don't listen to a ton of music loud at home. I mostly listen to it in headphones. Like, I mostly listen to it when people aren't around. Like, that's kind of like it's something I do in isolation.
Yeah. We're also like of a generation that has had headphones, which isn't the same for everybody else. I think like people our parents' age probably went to more concerts, or there were, there's probably a point in time where like a band would play at a party, and now it's
I don't think my dad has ever listened to music with headphones on. I think he only listens in the car on the stereo. When he listens to music, everyone listens to music, and I think my brother picked that up the same way. And I found that interesting because it's like to me it's a private experience. Because it's just like, I have this thing going on right here. And for other people, it's something that they share. And so this is the question I wanted to ask you. When we decide to isolate things that we enjoy or put ourselves in isolation to enjoy those things, is that because part of the art of it is indulgence? Or is that because part of it is shame? Like, are we embarrassed to share what we're into?
I think there's something incredibly special about those things that you find by yourself, and those things because then it becomes even more incredible when you find somebody you actually connect with on that front. For the longest time, I was the only I didn't have any friends who were into action figures. Like, I mean, when I was a little kid, sure, but like as far as collecting goes, I didn't know anybody who was on that same beat with me. And I would read like Toy Fair magazine, and they'd be like, oh, this is like there's a culture out there, and I'd find people online who would be into collecting and stuff. But as far as people I interacted with on a daily basis, that wasn't a thing.
Right.
And then once I met people like that, like you or like Scott Bromley, like that connection was like, oh, we can actually talk about this. This is a special thing. And I have the same thing with authors.
Yep.
I think music and reading are very much the same way, but. At the same time, music could also be like, oh man, like you want to go see, I got tickets for Iron Maiden, you want to go see Iron Maiden together, and it depends on what it is. But at the same time, like, I don't know, if you get hooked on some weird B-sides of some record that connects with you on a very personally, resonant level, it's not the kind of thing you're like, oh, you got to hear this,
Right. Which is really odd, It's like, because I very specifically, when I produce music, I feel like I'm producing like very personal headphone music for other people to listen to. And so like every now and then someone will say like, hey, I played your song like in my store. And I'm like, oh man, I didn't know you could do that. Like, and it's weird, but there's party albums, but there's no like party books. Right?
Maybe like Uncle John's bathroom reader, or like jumbo puzzles or something.
Yeah, stuff you leave in the bathroom for people to share. Yeah. But that's always odd. But I think that that's what's really interesting about it is that isolation to me is paramount to the process of creative growth. I think that you can't do comedy in a vacuum, but I think you have to grow in one. Like, I think that personal exploration, first of all, that's a lot of that starts at a young age as a sexual thing. Like, if a lot of people's first sexual experience is isolated, right? Yeah. And I think that like creativity is a very similar thing, and creativity is, not to get Freudian, but is almost as masturbatory.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's that term shower thoughts for like, my best ideas come to me in the shower. It's like, has it occurred to you that maybe it's because there's nobody else fucking there when you're in the shower?
And there's no noise, and there's nothing, there's no TV, there's no Twitter, your phone doesn't work in there.
You're not looking at what everyone else is doing. You're maybe touching yourself, and then also washing yourself, hopefully.
You should do that.
But also thinking, and that's the thing is you can't, sometimes to a fault, you can't stop thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I've read that like you straight up cannot.
Yeah,
You
that's
know?
what dreams are.
And it's funny when I've asked people, like, what are you thinking about? And they're like, nothing.
I don't get
That's
that.
impossible.
That's you liar.
So yeah, I find that really interesting because it's basically it's sort of realizing that we have to be alone for a specific amount of our lives, and there are parts of our lives where we are like even though everything that you look at the world and it's created in this way that funnels us into situations where we're with each other all the time. You know, we're always with people at work. We are always with people in movie theaters, public transportation, restaurants, bars. It's odd to think about, like, you basically, to stay alone, you have to live alone and then not leave.
Well, we also live in a major city.
Yeah.
You know, that's different. I think it's incredibly possible to lead a very isolated life and to really just go through and manage to stick to yourself entirely.
Well, yeah, like I said, you have to live alone and then not really leave. Like, but even then, I mean, you're going to interact with a delivery guy or somebody at the store or something somewhere.
Yeah, you got to run into somebody.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have, you know, people skills and interpersonal skills and stuff like that. But I also think it's really important to learn how to be alone. And I think being isolated is really important. I've heard like a saying of like, oh, he's afraid of his own shadow. And that's for people who are basically like, they like when things get too quiet, they start to get worried because they're like, no one's paying attention to me or no one's talking to me. And I think a lot of people's inability to be isolated is because their reliance on people in a social structure is that they feel like they have to feel needed. And like, if you're not needed as sort of like a friend or a lover or an owner of an animal or something like that, you know, like think about like if you're in your apartment, you're in your home, your cat and your dog isn't here, your roommate isn't here, your fiance isn't here. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities for you not to be isolated specifically. But if all those things go away, like, how are you okay? Do you turn to Twitter? Do you turn to Twitch?
I grew up pretty isolated because it was me and my mom, period. And so if she was at work or she was busy with something, typically I was by myself. And I think that was sort of like I don't know, in a lot of ways that was really miserable because we were like, I don't know, kids need to be around other kids and stuff. And I think that I don't know, like social skills wise, I think it threw a monkey wrench into things, but at the same time, I think it also planted sort of a creative seed because I was forced to sort of entertain myself and to kind of, you know, get in trouble and figure stuff out for myself. And I don't know, it's like everything else that we talk about in this show. I think that isolation is really important in moderation.
Yeah.
I think that it can be incredibly dangerous if people, I don't know, start kind of just like, Either if you can't handle it, if you're like, I can't be alone with my thoughts, that sounds horrible. Then it's like you have some stuff you need to unpack. But at the same time, if that's all you want to do, then that's, you know, other end of the spectrum. It's also, I think it's okay to want to be by yourself. I think it's really healthy to want some alone time here and there.
Yeah.
To process stuff, to unpack things. I used to have a really long commute, and I would spend my bus ride listening to music or reading or drawing or whatever it was, and in a lot of ways, I felt like sort of well-rounded when that was happening.
Yeah.
It gave me a chance to kind of reset between sort of the two places I was. And my commute now is weird because it is like in a crowded subway or, you know, surrounded by people. But I don't know. Isolation is weird. A friend of mine, kind of out of the blue, she seemed like a pretty normal girl in high school. After high school, like right after graduating, she just up and went to Japan, which is like a cool, fun thing to do. But it seemed like kind of more like, oh, was that like a sudden, are you running away from something? What are you doing? And she wrote about it a lot. And she really, one of the things that she wanted to do was, I think, probably inspired a bit by Lost in Translation, was to really just get out into the world and see what it was like when she was removed from everything around her.
Yeah.
Like she's like, how much of me is my surroundings? And she wrote this wonderful thing about how she found herself on a beach in like rural Japan in the middle of nowhere, far away from everything. And I think she had a phone on her, but she was like, you know, she wasn't like glued to Twitter or, you know, Instagramming everything. This was kind of before that was a thing. And she was sitting there on this beach. And this is one of those things that if you put it on paper, it sounds like, you know, suicidal thoughts or whatever. She's like, if I disappeared right now, nobody would know where I was.
Right.
They'd probably figure it out eventually, but like, I am so far removed from everything, and it was like so quiet, and that always struck me as something really important.
Yeah, I try to get that feeling a couple times a year, and I think it's interesting because you and I, we are very similar people in sort of the things we love and sort of our our friendship, our career, and everything like that. If it landed around the same things, we geek out around a lot of the same similar things. But I think because you were isolated so often growing up, you spend less of your time as an adult doing that, and because I grew up with two younger brothers. I shared a bedroom with a brother for years. We had two cats and then dogs. I had parents always around. I was always like a huge Italian loud family, just always people. I try to fight for isolation more now than I think than I should, maybe. Like it's good to have, but it's also, I think I married a pretty independent person in that we don't really feel like we heavily rely on each other like moment to moment that often. I mean, we're always there for each other, always, and we love each other. We sleep in the same bed, but also we also have our own hobbies and stuff like that. Like when I'm doing this show, she's off doing her thing, and
she doesn't panic when you're not around.
No,
which is
we can go hours without talking to each other and stuff like that. But I think it's interesting because it's like when I turned like 10, my youngest brother was born. Or he was like 8, or I was 8 when he was born, and then a couple years later, he decided he was going to move into the room I was in with my brother, and I was going to get my own room. And for the first time ever, I got my own room, and it was kind of amazing because I always had a roommate, a brother, somebody else who was just like, you'd be laying in bed and you'd be like, "Hey, Bri, like, what do you think the world's biggest brontosaurus is?" And I'd be like, "I don't know, probably like 200 feet." And, we'd be talking about it, and then I'd wake up in the morning, I'd go to like soccer practice and shit like that, and do all this stuff. Video games were communal. All my friends would come over and stuff like that. And I had my own room. And in that room, I had a TV, and I had like a Nintendo. And then eventually I got like a computer and a CD player, and I could listen to my own like songs and records and stuff like that. And I had this like epiphany where I was like, I really like being on my own. And then I moved to California. I didn't really know a ton of people. And, I had a roommate, but I had my own room. And then eventually I got my own apartments. And that was like surreal to me because I would look around and kind of be like, oh, it's just me here tonight. Mm-hmm. And I'd go to the store and I'd shop for one, and I'd go like, there was a moment where I was like, I like this because I don't think it'll always be like this. And, now that I'm married, I'm about to have a kid, it will almost never be like this again. Ever. And there's parts of me that kind of miss that. I think there's something interesting about that. On the flip side, I think that we are more than ever constantly isolated now, but we don't actually know it. Like we are placated into thinking that we are in these bustling communities. We're talking to people, we're communicating with people, we're texting people, but we're actually incredibly isolated.
Yeah, and I think that social media is sort of it's fake. It's fake society. It's fake interaction. It's not human compassion.
Right.
You ever see that shit with where they use like the puppet or whatever to hug the chimps?
Yeah. It was Henry Harlow, I believe, and he was a doctor in the 1950s, and he created surrogate maternal units for chimpanzees. The study is actually wildly controversial. I based my senior thesis on this guy's work. He effectively would remove these baby chimpanzees from their mothers at a very young age, like disconnect them entirely.
Isolate them.
Yeah, isolate them. And then he would give them surrogate mothers. And some of those surrogate mothers were wireframe, covered in cloth, that would heat up. Some would just sit cold, and others would actually electrocute. So he would inflict pain or warmth or just coldness onto these chimpanzees and to watch how they would react. And some of them would, because it's instinctual to keep going back for love despite receiving pain, would keep going back for love despite receiving pain. Others would become withdrawn and scared. They would piss themselves in the corner. Like awful things would happen. And it shows what happens when a creature is raised specifically in isolation, but also when it's kind of scared into isolation by scenarios that happen to them. Like if you have a bad night at a bar and you never want to go to a bar again, chances are you might just never go to a bar again, and that just becomes a thing you don't do anymore. So I think that's what happened here. I mean, if you got electrocuted at the bar, you probably wouldn't go very often.
It sounds like an interesting bar.
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't go there unless it was really cool, and then maybe I'd go back. But,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I find that kind of terrifying, because I think that that study, again, controversial because they took babies away from their mothers.
Right.
And that's fucking horrible. But it was interesting in that it taught us how we react to stimuluses and how we react to negative situations and sort of punishment. And
well, the reason I bring it up is because like you look at social media, you know, and you look at I have friends on the internet. I have friends on Facebook. I have friends on Twitter. I can interact with strangers. And I think there's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to be like, oh, that's not real. That's fake. And that's not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
There's this meme I love for kind of obvious reasons because we make podcasts for a living, but it's like when you listen to a podcast and it's this guy who's sitting there and he's eating a bowl of cereal and laughing, and he's next to like a poster of people, like it's like an ad for cereal, and they're all doing the same thing, and it's like, those aren't real people.
Yeah, I love that picture. Yeah, it's
and
really funny because people will send it to me, and I'm like, because we try to do a good job of building community around everything we do. And I think that's awesome because it solves some of the problems that we talked about like creating an isolation and not sharing your work, not getting feedback and stuff like that.
Yeah, but I think that there's still an element missing with strictly online interaction, is that it's you may be like, oh, I'm getting some kind of social sustenance from this engagement.
Yeah.
But it's not the same as actually like being with people and being around people. And I think there's that, like, I don't know, people have social anxiety, and that's a valid concern. And it can also, conversely, being around people can be more exhausting in ways you don't necessarily process.
Yes.
We have the offices we work at IGN it's an open office, which is I talk to my therapist about this all the time, about how it's you don't think of it as being social interaction when it's sort of like a passive thing, but it's like if everyone's running around and yelling and talking, you're still absorbing that. You're still kind of you're still in a social situation, and it's also like you can put on noise canceling headphones, but like you can't turn your ears off.
No, or your eyes.
Yeah. Like you could. Well, no. I mean, you can close your eyes. That's the thing. There are no earlids.
Right.
I heard that on some other podcasts, but like I love that concept because, if you hear a word that you perk up, and you're like, oh, and if they're talking about this thing, and you're absorbing information whether you want to or not, and on some level that is that social interaction.
Yep.
You might just be eavesdropping like a weirdo, but you're still sort of present,
Yeah. I find that tough to battle sometimes because like it kind of puts you in a place where if you want to hang out with your friends or you're dating somebody, they have to be on the same sort of like isolation frequencies as you. Mm-hmm. Whereas like I dated a girl briefly that had a very isolated job. And she was basically in a cubicle, and it was quiet, and no one talked to her all day long. And then when she got out of work, it was like she wanted to go be social, and I was social all day. And when I got home, I wanted to be isolated.
Right.
And it created sort of, among other things, a clash that made it so our frequencies never really lined up. And I notice it with some of my friends who don't work the same way I do, where they get out and they're like, it's party time, and for me it's like, no, it's quiet time.
Yeah.
And that's tough.
I mean,
that's tough to deal with.
I have that with my fiance. She's a dentist, and that's a job where you I don't know, you put your hands in strangers' mouths. It's not it's social in a twisted sort of way, and there is interaction and everything. And she hangs out with her her assistants and stuff. But at the same time, it's much more it's a much more of a real job than hanging out with your best friend and talking about Star Wars action figures and video games. So I don't know. There's parts of me where I'm like, well, I've argued about the Avengers enough this week. I think I want to go home and sit on the couch quietly and read. And she's like, I need to get the fuck out of here and go do something fun. I need to like cut loose, So it's similar in that sense. But at the same time, there are times when I'm feeling sociable and she's not. And so it's a matter of kind of, mutual sensitivity and figuring that out. But yeah, like we said, isolation. It has a time and a place.
Yeah. I that's like such a cool thing about it too, is that it's like I think I think you should find time for it. You should definitely find time for it. I won't even say it. I will flat out say it is tremendously important and paramount to your personal growth and evolution as a person, period. To find isolation.
Yeah. No, I think there's that when you say isolation, you think in the middle of nowhere, far away from everything. It's the Unabomber. You're a weirdo if you want time to yourself, or you've got shit wrong with you. But no, you don't. You need time to decompress and to kind of like. You got to defragment your disk drive there. You know?
So what sucks about that is the negative connotations around isolation make it so you feel ashamed if you do things by yourself that are sort of historically seen as things that you do in public. If you go see a movie by yourself, right? Mm-hmm. People look down on you. Movies are communal. Movies are things you go in with a big group. Which is,
again, still really fucking weird because that's also an experience where you sit in a dark room and don't talk.
Yeah.
So like the whole idea of like going to the movie as a date is like, so you would like to spend 2 hours not talking to your date.
Think about somebody goes to the movie and they're sitting next to you and they're by themselves and they get up and they leave. Their experience was the exact same experience you had, except for you get to turn to your friend and go, well, that was dumb. Mm-hmm. But he just gets to think in his head, well, that was dumb. And we judge him for that, you know?
When I think of people going to the movies by themselves, and this is hilarious because like it's something I want to try to do more often.
Yeah.
I think of this woman that I sat next to when I saw Return of the King, and she brought like a Tupperware thing full of just like some kind of hard liquor. And she's just like this sad woman who's just drinking by herself at the movies. But then at the same time, I'm like, honestly, that sounds awesome. That sounds like a great time.
Yeah, but like you said, you called her a sad woman, but you came around to it, right? Because I think like your gut reaction is to be like, oh, what's wrong?
I was with somebody.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, dude, this is fucked up. That lady's just like drinking out of that thing by herself. And I'm like, I don't know what her fucking day job is. I don't know what she was doing.
Yeah. I mean, maybe she's seen movies with shitty people 100 times and she was like, I'm so sick of this. Maybe she's got 6 kids at home and they climb all over her and yell constantly.
The only movie I've seen by myself was Blade Runner 2049.
Yeah.
And I ate some weed beforehand and it felt like this like kind of like daring adventure to be like, ooh, I'm going up by myself. I've never done this before. Mm-hmm.
It's weird because I live within walking distance of a movie theater, and it's something I definitely want to do more often. And it's something I'm very conscious of with the kid on the way, of sort of just like, we need our personal time. We need our alone time. It's what they tell every parent to be like, make sure, because you're constantly teaming up in unison to keep something alive forever. And part of you needs to sort of get away from that and go do something and go somewhere else. Restaurants are another place. They are by their nature designed for pairs, for groups. Like, you don't really see a lot of single seating places at restaurants.
That's something I love about airports.
Yeah,
is that it's like an airport is a place where it's completely normal to eat to be completely by yourself, to be eating alone, to have a drink by yourself. It's like completely. It's not
such a good point.
It's a completely different like just environment for that. But yeah, like the restaurant thing. There's a whole thing on like Friends about that and like the sort of the stigma surrounding it. But like really, when you get down to it, why is that weird? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing like a decent amount of travel for this thing I'm doing for IGN, and I booked it so I have like a bookends around the shoots, where the shoot days I'm with 9 people and the other days I'm with no people. I'm by myself and I'm in a city that I don't really know, that I've been to a couple times, and I try to make it so I get there and I have my headphones on, my sunglasses, I'm kind of in my shell and I walk around, and if someone sees me and says hello, then sure, I'll say hi. But I'm mostly there to just sort of stay in my bubble. And then I go to restaurants and I eat by myself and I take pictures, and I go to stores and I shop by myself, and it's very it's sort of very freeing and liberating, because I don't feel like I'm on anybody else's time. I don't feel like I'm holding anybody back.
I love that. That's a wonderful feeling.
Especially
it's
it's something like I'll go shopping for stuff by myself because I don't want to drag somebody else along that process, or like
at the same time, going shopping with somebody else is also like interesting, because you're like, oh, what do you think of this? And they're like, I hate that. Don't wear that. You look like a clown.
Yep.
Clearly, I shop alone.
Yeah, it happens almost immediately. So I think it's. I think you should find those moments. I don't think it should be. I don't think it should overpower you. I also don't think that. I think you should be conscious of the amount of time you're spending in communal situations that aren't actually there. Like, like you talked about finding someone that likes an action figure. There's entire subreddits dedicated to that. We both check them often.
Yeah.
If we only looked at those things and we didn't really go to like toy fairs and Comic-Cons and PAX and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think it would be, it's not necessarily dangerous, but it's just something I think you have to be conscious of, Like, I think it's good to spend time with others here and there. I think it develops good social skills. I'd be really interested in talking to sort of like YouTubers, Twitch streamers, the kind of people who are in isolation, but sharing every moment of that with everyone all the time. Like people who are on all day, when they get out of work, do they want to see other people in real life, or do they feel like they don't need to do that because they have been interacting with people all day without actually touching them or feeling them or seeing them?
It's actually the whole sort of streamer culture thing is interesting. I was talking to my stepmother about this because she was watching my nephew watch like some Minecraft Let's Play or something, and I was trying to explain the idea of like watching a Twitch stream and the idea that like end of the day that's sort of like if you were on your friend's couch watching them play games, except the couch was huge and there was hundreds of people on the couch and you're talking to each other on this giant couch, and that's like, again, that's kind of a weird way of explaining it, but it's a chat room first and it's a screen second. And I think that's frequently lost on people, and it's just sort of it's reductive to be like, oh, you're just watching someone else play. It's like, no, we're connecting over a thing that's happening as it's happening.
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't know, I've come around on that. I think initially I was like, I didn't quite get it, but it's sort of, and I think a good streamer will be really, it's kind of like being an MC. It's like being a party host almost. Like you're making the rounds and making sure everyone feels included and making sure nobody's fighting and that, it's sort of driving the conversation. But yeah, again, it goes in that sort of odd gray area of what is modern social interaction. Yeah,
and I think that's what makes it tough, because we're like, if you think about it like a video game, like when you fill that meter, it makes you not, you don't want to do anything more with it, right? Like you hit the top of it, it's full, it's done. And so I'm very sort of conscious of that, where I'm like, oh, like I've been, I got all of my sort of social stuff done here. But it's like, I don't know, like you and I don't really get, we hang out all the time, but it's rare that we're like, hey, let's just like get fucked up on a Friday night. Because it's like when we're not doing this show or a different show.
We haven't hung out without microphones and cameras involved it's been a minute.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
I think the last one was seeing Star Wars, probably.
Yeah.
So December, like,
and even that kind of funnels into like a work situation.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I think we're very broken people when it comes to that, because like even
I'm not complaining,
Yeah.
And it's also like we got shit to do. I got to plan a wedding. You got a kid on the way. It's like that's sort of, that's a matter of growing up. But, So I don't know. Another thing I want to bring up real quick though is I think there's a misconception that you are either an introvert or an extrovert.
Yeah.
And I think that there's also like it's okay to have little bits of both. I think there are people who they're like, oh, I'm an introvert. And then some people are just straight up introverted. Some people just kind of lay low. And some people are also, infuriatingly type A and just gad about the party and chat with everybody. And they have no qualms whatsoever about interacting. And they don't have any kind of like, social refractory period where they're like, I need peace and quiet now. Leave me the fuck alone. They're just always on.
Yeah.
And I think it's totally also normal to kind of walk a line between the two.
Yeah.
We'll get back from big shows like E3 or Comic-Con or whatever, where it's been, hundreds of short conversations with strangers or with people we know, and just trying to remember names and just making FaceTime and just kind of a mosh pit of human interaction. And I'll get back from one of those things and I'm like, I need to not talk. I need to not be with human beings.
Yeah.
I need just silence.
And it's healthy to recharge that battery. You tweeted something during GDC about how you weren't feeling, the games developer conference here in San Francisco, you weren't feeling particularly social that week. And so you didn't really go to parties. And like, I think that's okay. Like, I think there's this notion that we kind of have to do stuff. And again, looking at video games, like GTA 4, I think is probably the best video game about realistic relationships, in that like you have to kind of keep it up. And if you don't, they stop calling you, or they get mad at you and they go away. And that sucks, but that's sort of the harsh reality of it. I think there's like, it's cool when you get a friend where there's a mutual understanding that everybody's busy and it's hard to sort of reconnect all the time.
I think that's the sort of litmus of solid friendship is if you're not constantly in touch with somebody.
Yep.
And it's like if you're thinking of them, and if you reach out here and there, and you're like, hey, you keep tabs on them. I think that's where sort of social media works. Where it doesn't work is when it's you're sort of keeping a friendship on life support.
Yeah.
Where it's like this was an acquaintance that you tricked yourself into thinking there was more to it.
Yeah. And I think it's getting more and more difficult this day and age, specifically with job titles, to isolate one part that you want to excel at. Like there's so many like I'm a jack of all trades. I'm a Photoshop. Like I do design, social media, marketing, blah blah, host, produce, like, blah blah blah. Everyone I know, even people that just that don't even have creative jobs, have to do 5 or 6 things nowadays. That's just the way it all works.
Yeah, and you got to remember how to tie your shoes and do your laundry, otherwise your underwear stinks. Like
in terms of isolating one thing from that list, to really hone it and really sharpen that blade, it's very tough to do. And going back to music production, it's something I'm very conscious of, because a lot of the music I make sort of starts with something simple and then builds and builds and builds, and then it has that kind of climax, or maybe dies down or whatever it is, and ends. Ends are the hardest part, by the way. That's never easy to do. That and naming songs, just fuck all that.
Just repeat the last part and have it gradually fade out. That's a good way to do it.
Yeah, why do you think so many people are like, Untitled, The White Album, No Name, or whatever it is? Like, yes, they don't want to name it. But it gets, like, when you're building up to so much noise, and you've got the drums and the bass and the keys and everything like that, it's almost antithetical to teach your brain to remove every layer but the piano, and just let the piano play for a bit, and isolate that sound, and just let it be on its own. And I think that's something that I try to get better at, that everything has to be so chaotic and so convoluted. And it's like, well, maybe it doesn't. Like, maybe instead of being like okay at 10 things, I can be really good at one every now and then. Yeah. I can be a master of one.
The skills. We talked about all the isolation as a social concept. We didn't really get into it as, you just did right there. Yeah, but I don't know. Get one thing right, There's that Simpsons quote about I think it's like Homer becomes a food critic, and there's like the old food critic is just he's like an old crab, and he's like reviewing Baskin Robbins, and he's like, why make 31 flavors if you can't even get vanilla right? And everyone's like, retire already, we hate you. But I kind of love that idea of like that. I mean, that's sort of that mastery. It's if you think about it, like really honing a craft is a concept of isolation.
I think that makes perfect sense, because I like I enjoy pizza, and when I travel, I like to find the best pizza wherever I am, and I always get either a simple margarita pizza, which is like 3 ingredients, or I get like a half cheese, half pepperoni, and people are always without fail like, why didn't you get this on it? Why didn't you get this on it? And I'm like, I like to isolate the simplicity of what this is, because to me, if you can't get that down, then why bother making anything on top of it?
It's almost like a calibration. You know? It's like you've got this simple concept, and it's like this is the baseline. This is like the simple thing.
It's like if the isolated act of jumping in a platforming game isn't fun, then I feel like the rest of the game is going to kind of fall apart, and you can add all the best art, music, voice acting, anything you need, but the simple, like, something has to be sort of at its most basic and most isolated, work really well, and be strong enough to stand on its own, I think. And so, that's a lot to unpack there. And I find the irony in creating this show, A, with somebody else, and then B, to share it with you, who as a listener or viewer probably you're enjoying on your own. This is not really a party podcast.
Not really. But I mean, if we're keeping you company in your ears and making you think about how you interact with other people, that's totally cool.
Yeah.
We got a couple quotes I want to end on real quick. One of them is from a famous isolationist, Henry David Thoreau, who locked himself in a cabin to write about frogs or whatever in that stupid book. He said, I find it wholesome to be alone the greater part of the time. To be in company, even with the best, is soon wearisome and dissipating. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude.
Wow.
Meanwhile,
I love that. I really love that.
John Donne said, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And then meanwhile, Rudyard Kipling was like, shots fired, fuckers. We're all islands shouting lies to each other across seas of misunderstanding. Brap, brap. And he just, wrote the Jungle Book or whatever. Yeah, obviously, the concept of being alone is not a new thing. People have been talking about that forever, but it's always sort of shifting and changing with
The Jungle Book's an interesting one because it's about Mowgli, this boy that was basically raised without any other people. Not necessarily in isolation, but in isolation of his own species. And there was a story recently about a guy, it was like a real story about a guy that was like basically rescued from the woods where he was like raised by wolves. And he's like an adult now. And he was like, yeah, this kind of sucks, dude. Like, I kind of miss that wolf shit.
Yeah.
He's like, there's too much noise, there's too much going on. So
venison is too expensive. I used to just rip it out of their necks myself.
So yeah, I mean, find your personal balance, find what works for you. Do explore like your creativity in isolation, but I don't think you should just keep it there. I think where applicable, you should drag that art into the light and show it to others. Maybe take people's criticism with a grain of salt. Sometimes things designed by committee are that Homer Simpson car, to go back to The Simpsons, and you end up with this sort of monster.
Yeah, I mean, many hands lighten the load, but too many cooks spoil the broth. So everything in moderation, including moderation, because moderation kills the spirit.
Yeah.
On that note, if you want to unisolate yourself, my stupid ass dog is barking again. See, that's the thing. I never get any fucking peace and quiet here. It's always like dogs and cats running around. I'll be with you in a minute, dude. Calm down. Anyway, if you want to find us on Twitter, he's Agent Bizzle. I'm Max Scoville. You can follow Weird Heat on there too. We don't use that account enough, but we keep an eye on it. We of course are on Patreon, patreon.com/weirdheat, as well as Instagram, and we've got a Facebook group where people are posting all kinds of stuff that they're making and hanging out with each other, which is kind of cool. That's facebook.com/group/weirdheat. Obviously, subscribe wherever you listen or watch. It helps us out, and if you like this show, tell your friends, and hopefully you can figure out a better way to describe it than we do, because we're still sort of isolating that concept.
That's right. Thanks for listening. Weird Heat.